So this week we're focusing on the technical side. This is probably the trickiest bit for the bit last year. There's a bit of transition here from the previous labs, which you could sort of do just by reading the description of what you're being asked in the lab. This one requires a bit more effort, basically. So that's one of the reasons that this lecture, last lecture, is being recorded. Assuming all goes well, this one will be uploaded as well. And I'm going to go through bit by bit how you do Lab 4. And in particular, the key transition here is understanding how to use the web app to create pages and how to link between the code you write in Java and the HTML you create. So the main thing that we're going to start this lecture with is just looking at how you can use the forms. So the forms you have done in the second lab. And you take the information from the form and fill in values in an object. And add that, and ultimately, which is what you'll be doing in the lab after this, you'll be adding that object to the database. So really, if you can remember back to the lab where or the lecture where I showed examples of projects that other people have done, all of the projects are designed really around this core idea that the users are submitting information, and that all of you, pretty much all of you, should create a page which has a form as part of it, and that form is putting some information which typically will lead to the creation of an object that will be stored in the database, and the page that you're seeing is a page that's using information from the database. Okay? So if you've done web development in the past, you might have done a lot of the sort of content creation yourself. All of these projects are intended where the majority of the content is actually something that users provide, and the website is sort of a framework for showing that information, for searching that information, for linking that information together. And more complicated projects will have more complicated ways of visualizing that information, or the structures that they create in terms of having objects that refer to other objects will be more complicated, as well as potentially later on, towards the end of the course, we'll look at things like asynchronous JavaScript, where you can sort of polish the user interface experience. So all of those things are sort of impressive and good. What will be really wonderful this year is that some groups got as far as actually being able to sort of automate an initial amount of data into their database. So anyone who's keen on trying that out, I can help you with that later on as well. Okay, so let's just quickly review yesterday, okay? Or not yesterday, sorry, Monday. So, sort of introduce Bootstrap. Why does Bootstrap exist? It exists because the people who make web browsers don't like each other, and they're not terribly cooperative with each other, and it's a standards body, but lots of people disobey the standards body. So they're all, actually making a polished web application is quite difficult, because you end up having to put in all these test cases depending on whether you're on Internet Explorer or Firefox or Chrome, and then using slightly different code. So Bootstrap is an example of a company, Twitter in this case, making a library with a nice interface, which means that you don't have to worry about those issues. They've already solved them for you. As the web browsers add new functionality, Twitter will continue to maintain that API, and for the time being they have at least. And the key thing that Bootstrap provides is the ability to have web pages that look good on phone and look good on desktop, which is very difficult to do. And when you're constrained by saying your application must run on the phone, which makes a huge difference to the number of customers who use your website, and the number of end users as well, that really places restrictions on how complicated the layout and templates and stuff you use for your website. So you really need a good reason why you haven't used Bootstrap, or at least why your web application doesn't work on a mobile phone. That's why you're being encouraged to use it. And notice that W3 Schools, which is a website created by the standards body, they recognize that Bootstrap is so widely used that they provide a guide for using Bootstrap. So that's how legitimate it is in terms of the library. Pingendu is designed with Bootstrap in mind, so you can drag components and edit things, and Pingendu knows about Bootstrap components to make it easier to create web pages. So in terms of how you should proceed to the next lab, the first thing you want to do, so if you completed the lab from Tuesday, which you may not have, but at the end of that, you create your use case, and your use case consists of a number of steps. Each of those steps should correspond either to a new feature or a new web page. In order to submit the whole lab and get full marks for it, you also need to create static pages associated with each of those steps. But you just do that through the web app by clicking on Create Page, giving it a name, and then clicking Create Static Page. You don't actually have to mock it up and make it look like anything. You can just appear there with a title, and that's the end of the lab for this week. To do next week's, the first thing you need to do is turn that into a real sort of template. So if I run what we were doing last time, I will show you. Okay. Actually, just before I do that, I can show you what it looks like, right? So the last step of the lab for this week requires you to go to the pages link here and add a page. So the idea is everyone in your team makes their own use case, and then as a group, you agree a core set of pages. Ideally, you sort of partition the pages between you so that you all clearly have a contribution that you can make. And at this point, you create the pages. Okay, so in this case, I'd already created a front page one, and a search page one, and an index page. So the index page was the main one that I did on Monday. And when you just click create after having given it a name, and whenever you give it a name, you have to make sure that it is some kind of valid Java class name, which means the first letter is a capital and there are no spaces. Okay? And no HTML or anything like that. So it's something that you could call a Java class. And you can see that's true of these ones. So as soon as you click suggest a new page, which we can do now, it will appear down at the bottom of this list, which you can't see because I've zoomed out. Here we go. At this stage, it won't be part of your project yet. So it's something that you as a team can comment on, but if you download the zip, there will be no reference to it. Another thing to note is you can only remove pages that you submitted. So if you're ever in doubt about what you're responsible for or what you manage, it's the pages that you can remove. Okay. Then you need to do create static page. Okay, and now when you click on the zip for the project to download it, you will get a project that looks something like this. Okay, so whatever the name you gave to the class.html, it will be in your HTTP docs directory. Okay, so what we were talking about on Monday was using Bootstrap and Pingendu to make a mock-up of what your web page might look like. And so the first stage is sort of part of the design stage. So I'm just looking for my cursor. Here we go. Okay, so I think this one is the one. Okay, yeah, so you're just manually mocking it up. And you can see by manually mocking it up, you can start to put in things that sort of imply features that you're going to add later on. This is all just a static HTML. You just use Pingendu to mock up what this looks like. And typically students who would have got, say, thirds on the project, that's about as far as they would have gone. They would have a non-functioning website. But it would show you what it would be like if it was a real website. So the things we were talking about on Monday then was how you could then turn this static page into a dynamic page. So to do that, I just need to stop this. Okay.
Okay, so in this case, you go back to the Pages tab, and I've already done it because I did it on Monday. But if we take our one we faked up here, you click Turn into Dynamic Page. So after you've modeled something in Pengendu, you paste your static version that I just showed you into there to update the static page. And then when you're ready to start integrating the code and making it a dynamic page, you click Turn into Dynamic Page. This button here. Convert the static page into a dynamic page created by Java. Okay, so when you do that and you download the zip for the project, it will look a bit like this on the left. So in what was your index.html in the previous one will no longer be a static page in here, and it will appear as a Java class in the views folder. And automatically, there will be all the escaped HTML done for you. Okay. And the next thing that you need to do is then modify this and so that you're halfway towards this web page being created by something from the database. What you need to do for that is first you need to create classes for the kinds of information that you're going to store in the database. So in this case, in the example on Monday, I talked about there being a class for stories and a class for news events. So the idea being for this website is that there's a particular thing that really happened in the world, like Donald Trump's inauguration, and then there's a bunch of different news outlets that have written about that event in different ways. So you have one news event, and that news event has a number of stories associated with it. So when we look at the news event, we can see that it's got this array list, which means that we can store a varying number of stories associated with a particular event. Okay, so that's the kind of, increasing complexity that I'm talking about that you get rewarded for on this project quite heavily. Okay, so once you have this representation of the kind of information you wanted to store, you then want to pretend that you have a database and you have some examples of that. So you modify your index page, which previously was just nothing but escaped HTML. But this time you're going to make a sort of hard-coded example of a news event. So we're just pretending that this has come from the database. And we're just hard-coding in values associated with this particular object. But in the full implementation, what we'll eventually get to is that would have been something that was submitted by a user, and this code would actually extract from the database that entry. But we'll get to that later on. What we're doing now is the first step towards constructing this page from a sort of database object. So the next thing to do is to find in the HTML, so it's very important that you understand the HTML, and you can use things like inspect on Google Chrome. If you right-click on a part of the web page, it will show you where in the HTML source code that part of the page actually is. So you need to find that part of the page, say for the title, and replace it, instead of just being a string, you've got this bit here, okay? So you're now modifying the HTML with information from this object. So in theory, if you had loads and loads of news events, you could have a page for every one of those news events, and it would automatically provide the correct title. Okay, that's what that bit is doing. This example is a bit more complicated because as well as just having a string member of title and a string description, it's also got this array list. So the idea here is that for every news event, there are multiple stories written about that news event. And so you'd have this array list. And the array list would store some kind of unique ID associated with each of the stories. So at a later point, and we'll see some example of how to do that, you would have a web page on which someone could fill in a news story from the Daily Mail or something like that and submit it. And it would then that a new object would be created just for that news story, that Daily Mail news story. And then this news event would also be modified to point to that news story by using its unique ID. I'll talk a bit more about that in the later lecture today about how databases work with this kind of way of pointing to one another. But like I say, this is one of the trickier parts of the course, so if you're finding it a little confusing, that's understandable. Please come and ask questions in the labs, and I'll do everything I can to make that clear. So what we're doing for the news event is just the same as we did up here. If this was the fully implemented version, you would take this unique ID and you would look up in the database associated with all the news stories. There'd be like a table associated with all the news stories, and you would grab the one associated with the unique ID. But because we're not getting to the stage of dealing with the database yet, we're just making a hard-coded example of a news story. And we're just filling in a little bit of its detail. But what we've got here is we've taken a part of the web page. So if I go back to the web page example. Okay, so there's this whole bit here, right, which is talking about a particular news story. And that whole piece of HTML, in theory, we want to repeat that for every news story, for the Daily Mail, for the Mirror, for the Sun, whatever. Okay? So that's why we have a loop here. So we're looping through all the elements in that array list. In this case, for testing purposes, we've just added the same one twice, just to make sure it goes through the loop. And each time through the loop, it would go and get that ID and get a story, and you'd fill in different information. So again, to do this, to find out where this block of code is on the page, you can right-click on it in Chrome, and then you can go to Inspect, and it will show you the highlighted bit of HTML you need to cut out. Okay? And then you do the same thing. So you find the bit that's the title, and you replace the string with this code that's basically adding in the data from the database. Okay? And if you actually run this code, what you end up with is a page that looks a bit like this, but you have two versions of the story repeated one after another. Okay? Using whatever was put in this hard-coded value here. Okay. Right, so that will take you up, I think, to about task 3. And then task 4 that we want to talk about, again, is quite tricky. So task 4 is saying, okay, to do this properly, we also want the ability for the users to add information to the website. That's the whole idea of all of these websites. So to do that, we want a form. I just need to check. Yeah, it's actually here. Okay. So, so this is in, just in case you're looking up, so I think it's in lab 4. Let me just double check. So lab 4 underscore, no, sorry, lab 4 underscore 5 is where the form gets added. Okay. So if you've been following the steps I've been talking about, you will have got to this stage and you will have taken a page that was automatically made for you, this one, okay, that's converted your static HTML you probably made in Pingendu into this code. And then the step for stage 3, you will have modified that a little bit, so adding a loop and changing a little bit of the lines here. But say you want to add a form, that's quite a substantial change to the page. So one way you can do that is if you load up Pingendu, which I think I already have somewhere. Yep. Okay, and again, things look a bit weird because the internet connection isn't super reliable in here. So what you can do then is you can, if you want to add a form, you can just make a new page with just the bit you want to add, and do what you would have done for the lab 2, where you just drag a form and stick it in, which should be here somewhere. Forms, there we go. stick the form in, and then make the modifications that you would have made for Lab 2 to make a functioning form. Okay, and that will give you a whole bunch of HTML down here. So the question is, how do you integrate this new thing that you've built into your web page? Well, what you can do is you can now make a fake page. So I think, yeah, this is still running, okay? So let's make a fake page, right? So just a temp page. Just a new page. Okay. And it's down here, temp page. So just paste in the form or whatever other component you want to add to the page to create static page. Okay, and then you can use the web app's automated escaping features basically to convert the page into a code page. Okay, and then everything in that field will now be a big load of Java code that has escaped all of the HTML for you, right? So what I'm just going to do, to save time a little bit, is try to find the bit that's just the form. So that looks promising, div class form. There we go, so we just want the form bit. So what I'm doing is I'm searching for the line that starts form. Hopefully that makes sense to you. You might not be able to see that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm searching for that because that's the start of the form. And I'm just going to copy that, all the stuff to do with the form, and stop when I get to the end of the form, which is there. Okay. So now you sort of use the web app to create a form. So in this case, we just want to add a form to the page somewhere. So we just paste that in. And now what we've done is we've just added that thing that we mocked up in Pigendo into this dynamic page, and the dynamic page will now have a form in it. Okay. Another thing that you can do as well is if you want to make small changes to your page and you have a dynamic page, you can run the page through the web server so that you get something like this appearing, partially generated by code. And then you can right click on that, view the page source, copy all of that and do the same set of steps that I just did, and it will automatically escape it for you. So you could just save that page out, modify it with Pigendo, and do the same kind of trick to end up with a sort of modified page. So these are different ways that you can just make your life a little bit easier in terms of modifying dynamic pages. Okay, but what are we really trying to do here? Well, let's have a look at our example, which should be on resources as well, so you can have a look at it yourself. So in the example, what I've done is the code which I added to do with the form, I've put between curly braces. And what you'll find towards the end of your project is your web pages will get quite big and a little bit complicated, but they'll also be redundant in that multiple members of your team will probably do similar things, like they'll have a heading at the top, or they might have a search bar, or various things like that. So you can actually extract some of that into a separate function. One way, a step towards doing that is to take these meaningful chunks of the web page and wrap it in curly braces. And something I mentioned in the comment is something I do a lot when I'm doing developing myself, is you can just put, if you just say if false, it will not do any of that code for you, so you can sort of dynamically change it. And because of the way Eclipse works, this could be a running web server, and you could change that to true, like that, and save it. And even if the web server was still running, that would dynamically be recompiled, and you could just refresh the page, and you'd see what it was like when the form appeared or disappeared. So these are all good tips for debugging and kind of understanding the dynamic pages that you make. So the real question is, how do we make a functioning form? So in Lab 2, we made a form that went to the page test form. Now, in your group project, test form is not linked in to the rest of the project, so you can't use that to test with. You can go back to the previous code base that you had if you really want to try it out like that. You can also make your own dynamic page that basically you just copy the test form code into, then you can use that for debugging if you like. But what we're doing is we're making a new kind of path here that we're going to use, and that's going to be, so whenever you click on the button, the browser is going to request that path from the server, and just like in Lab 2, it's also going to pass across whatever information that we have in the input fields. Okay, so in this case, there is a string called title, there is a text input called title, there's a text input called description. Okay, you can see I did this very quickly, just using the standard templates from Pingendu. And then a button, which just says add story. Okay. So when you press this button, what's going to happen is it's going to access the server and it's going to say, give me this page. Now you'll notice that this page is quite different from the other pages we've been looking at. So all the other pages, they were index.html, some kind of direct page like that, or an image or something like this. So this has got a sort of in-depth thing. This is just a coding convention that I tend to use when I'm making web apps this way. So the question is, how do you create the code that responds to the form that you've submitted? Okay, so the way the web server works is whenever there's a path that's been requested from the web browser, it runs in each of the dynamic pages, and it just runs these if statements, right? So if the path happens to match this thing, then it does this code, it returns true, and no other page handles it, right? So you can actually make as many other pages as you like and stick their code in here. So what we've done here is we've just added an else and an extra if statement. So what this means is when someone clicks the add a story button on this page, it's going to go through each of the dynamic pages, and it's going to say, are you a dynamic page that handles this kind of page request? Now the path won't be index.html, but it will be index.html/submit/news story. Okay, so you can sort of think of this as like a function call, and this is defining a function, and then the variables are being passed through the form in the form of the named values. So once you have this is like another page that you will go to. It's a sort of special page that's responding to that form button press. So it's just like in the Lab 2, it's taking the values from the form, so the title and the description, and it's adding them to the variables of your object. So the whole idea is when a user presses this button, they're going to create a new news story object. It's going to be added to the database. An important thing to note here, every time you add an object to the database, it needs a unique name. What's happening here is that this story is being given a unique name by adding the system current time in milliseconds. So what that means is that it's like a timestamp. And due to the way in which the web server works, that it's not running in parallel, only one news story will ever get one of these timestamps because of the time it takes to process. So effectively, you've got a unique number now associated with this news story, and that's like a pointer to, it's almost like a pointer to memory, but it's a pointer to somewhere on the disk, okay, associated with the database. That's the unique idea of the story. Now, to make the whole thing work, we don't actually look at news stories, we look at news events. News events have references to news stories, and then those news stories are loaded in. So for a news story to be visible in our application, we need to link a news story to a news event. okay? And the way that we do this is that we pass in the unique ID of the news event, okay? So how do we do that? Okay, so when this dynamic page is being created, it's being created for a particular news event. And each news event will have its own unique ID. Everything in the database has its own unique ID, okay? So whenever we're creating this form, as well as having inputs that you type things into, you can also have one of type hidden. So that's one that a normal user of the web page would never see. But within the HTML of the page, this information is now being passed through. So whenever someone clicks the button, this extra hidden information will now be passed through to the server. So what that means is that when you're responding to someone submitted a news story, you can now grab that as if someone had typed it into the form and link your news story to a news event. So the way it would actually work is that at this point you would get the unique ID for the news event, and well, in fact you don't even have to access it from the database, but oh no, you do, sorry. Then you would look up into the database to get the news event, and then you would modify that news event by adding to its list of stories. Okay, which is just like the code we have hard-coded in here. And we're adding the unique ID for the news story we've just added. So what that means is whenever this page is viewed again, there will now be an extra element in here for the story that was just added, and an extra block will appear on the page. Now that will only work once the database is all connected together, so you won't see that full functionality working for the next lab. It'll be the lab after that when you get the full can add stuff to the database, see the page change and everything like this. But this is getting you sort of halfway there. And the final thing to note is, so the user has gone to a form, they've clicked the button, it's requested a page. What do you return back? Okay, so what you can do is, this is just creating a page like any other. So it could have a string to send to web browser in it, and you could construct a page. And last year, quite a lot of people would have created it whenever they clicked on submit on their form. They would have gone to a page that said, thank you for submitting this thing, something like that. And then it would have had a link on it, which would have taken you back to the front page or something like that. Sometimes, however, what's a little bit nicer is if you just go back to the page you were currently on. Okay? So what that means is that when somebody hits submit, from their perspective, it just looks like the screen flashed and redrew. And the way you can achieve that is one of the replies you can give from the server to the browser is to say, I'm not actually going to tell you what the page is. Instead, you should go to this other page instead. So that's what this code is doing. It's redirecting to the front page. And so assuming the browser is working properly, it will just flash and show you the front page. So the effect of that is somebody adds in some information about a news story, they click the button, and then the screen flashes, and they see that detail just as they've added it in. What we'll cover at the end of the course is how you can use some asynchronous JavaScript to have a web page where you click submit, and the screen doesn't even flash. It just sort of adds the content in a very slick way. So that's the way something like Gmail would work, or something like that. It looks that way. But that is enough then to get you through all of Lab 4. Okay. So like I say, there's a lot of increased complexity here. There's a lot of complexity that is specific to the web server. That's why this is being recorded. That's why we've got the code online. You should expect this to be a bit difficult. Please come and talk to me and I can help you try to get through this. Once you've got the hang of this, and the next lab where you say to the database and read from the database, you have all the technology you need to make most of the features of your web apps. Okay? The heart of your web apps is the ability for users to create content and add
really, after those labs, most of the lectures will be showing specific features that people are interested in, like login systems, search features, and there's a little bit more to tell you about in terms of having web pages that are specific to objects that have been created. But I don't want to distract you with all that now. So that is the core thing. But like I say, this is a tricky thing, so expect to have to put quite a bit of effort into concentrating on it and getting help in order to follow it. Okay. So let me just double check I've gone through everything. So this was just the things that I was talking about today. So we continued on. We added to the news event the HTML so that there's now a form. We modified the get method and the action method and the name just as we did for lab 2. We added that hidden element, which is the way to be able to link things together. We used the trick of making a temporary page, which you can then delete after you've used it, to do the escaping automatically for you, and embedded that into the code. And then we looked at how you add an additional path. So you now have a single dynamic page that responds to 2 addresses. And that's a way of keeping the functionality together. And then we looked at things like how to make a unique name for an object that you're going to submit using the timestamp. Okay. And then we talked a little bit about how you could redirect the browser if you wanted to, or you could create a page saying thank you for what you submitted or something like that. And we can use Ajax in the future. Okay, and that is enough to complete the next lab. Okay, so there are a few other things I'll talk about, but I think I'm just going to save all of those for this afternoon because I think this is the meatiest bit of the lab, and I don't want to overwhelm you with things. Okay, so thank you very much.